So who is Amar the person?
I knew that was coming. I just set myself up for that one.
You set yourself up.
A lot of people think I came out of nowhere. And well, actually, no, I had millions of views. I had tens of thousands of followers. I had all this thing with just a Silicon Valley based audience. So when I started at BHQ, I already had this massive experience. Because of what my dad did, then that's the only reason I am my time today. If my dad didn't encourage me to quit my job, I probably wouldn't have quit. And we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't have had any of the conversations I've had. And there's so many people who don't have that in their families, who don't have that in their friendship groups. So if the Bay HQ is that thing, that is that support system for the people who don't have the support I had, then I'm paying forward that belief my dad had in me. In 30 years' time, are the people who built organizations which would completely change the world, who wouldn't have done it if we didn't exist. Today on the podcast, the tables are turned, and I'm the guest. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amardeep Parmar, the co-founder of the Bay HQ, which is the #1 community for British Asian entrepreneurs, operators and investors. We've got Divya Talwar here, who's a BBC investigative journalist, to probe me, tell my story, so that you guys understand where this all came from, who I am, and why I'm building what I'm building today. I hope you enjoy this episode, and it's interesting to be on the other side, and this podcast is powered by HSBC Innovation Banking.
So Amar, the tables have turned. You're in the hot seat today. How do you feel?
Good. Actually, it's easier being on this side, I think.
Oh, really? Well, let's see. So Amar, to understand you better, what are some of the earlier experiences you've been through that people should know about?
When I was growing up, I grew up in East London, around Ilford, but it was always this situation where you knew what you knew. So that was my environment, 95% Asian. I spoke like Bernang, Chung, you're right, yeah, how's it going? But that was just normal. And I think that environment and how people interact with each other, I'm glad that I had that environment. So obviously there's bits where it's tough and things like that, but you got used to a certain kind of environment, which meant you could have fun, you could have different things. Which then when I went to other places, it meant they had this different perspective, which I'm quite happy about that I had school in one kind of environment, and my university was Bath, which is completely opposite in many ways. But because I had both, it means I can interact with people better. And I think it makes a huge difference. And even looking back like earlier times, I think I just did so many different things when I was a kid. And I was very lucky that my parents obviously allowed me to do that, where drive me to karate, to cricket, to football, to piano, all of those different kind of things. That is a real privilege that I got to do that. And that's because like my mum would drive me around and take me to those things. But all those different experiences meant that I had this wider perception than many other people did at my age, maybe.
You mentioned your parents there. What influence did your mum and your dad have on you?
I think it was always a case of they didn't push me, but then I naturally had that push in some ways. And obviously because of the situations I was in, then because I was used to high achieving, I would continue to do that. And it would be weird in some ways where, say for example with karate, I did karate throughout my GCSEs, my A-levels. And they would encourage me to do that because they're like, oh, you shouldn't just be working all the time. So it was almost very anti-Asian in some ways of usually your parents are telling you to always study and things like that. Whereas mine were like, oh no, you need to make sure you take a break, make sure you do these things. So I was very fortunate in that regard about the balance and how they viewed things, rather than just being like, oh, you need to get the best grade so I can show you off. They trusted me to get the good grades that I could get, but they also wanted me to have that more well-rounded balance to me as well. So I think I was very fortunate in that regard.
And what impact do you think that had on you?
Because I didn't have the pressure from other people, I almost put the pressure on myself. And it's one of the things I haven't quite worked out of why did I put so much pressure on myself and why do I continue to do that? Because for some people it comes from their parents, right? Their parents pushed them so hard as a kid, so they continue to do that. Where for some reason I'm just some masochist that puts loads of pressure on myself and enjoy and thrive in that kind of situation. So because they gave me these opportunities, I think what effect it had is that I know what I'm capable of. Because I did all these different things, I know that I can do those things. If you never really had those experiences, then you have a smaller idea of what's possible. So I think that's one of the big things that the way they parented me gave me is that like, oh yeah, why can't I do that? Whereas maybe other people were more pushed down a particular path. My dad did want me to go to Cambridge because he would always say it's like a journey down the M11 or wherever it is. But when I didn't get that or I was on the borderline of that, whatever, there was no, oh, you've disappointed me or anything like that. It was just, it would be cool if you do it. If you don't do it, then we don't really. I'm also I'm quite a good kid. I never really got in trouble. So it does help. Whereas if I was a bit of a troubled child, then I'm guessing would have had a different experience.
That's quite rare, isn't it? Because you often hear young British Asians saying their parents did have a lot of input into what they do, come and become a doctor, become a lawyer, become an accountant. That's rare that you didn't have that growing up.
I think there was an element of them wanting me to be a doctor at some point, but it was never forced upon me. So I did biology, chemistry, maths and economics, which is basically me just pushing down the decision. So instead of having to decide at 16, I was like, okay, with these A-levels, I can decide later on. But they never really said you have to do a particular thing. And I think economics it's not a one that would trigger problems because there's always different career options with that. My dad himself was an accountant. So, but even then, he'd never really pushed me to go down the accountancy route. I did work experience there, which was mainly really just moving boxes around. It wasn't actually accounting. So my CV when I was 21 might be lying a bit about what I actually did there, which I think many kids do as well. But it was me moving around boxes and files and things like that. But that experience at least showed me working in the city and things like that. But yeah, they never really pushed me towards a particular career. As far as I had no idea what I wanted to do. And even now, I'm changing my ideas all the time about what I'm doing.
So you do economics at university. What was the plan at the time?
Well, the plan was to get rich and retire by the time I'm 30, so that didn't quite work out. It's actually quite weird. So I had this very specific idea when I was at university, and I don't know where I got it from or why it was so specific, but it was going to investment banking or something like that, become a multimillionaire by the time I'm 30, then retire and become a teacher. And the whole idea, so I used to teach karate, so I taught karate for about 5 years. I was black belt when I was like quite young, so then I was able to teach quite a lot. So the idea is like, oh, that's a good way to make a difference, right? And then obviously growing a bit older, when it's got closer to 30, I'm like, wait, do I actually want to be a teacher? I've said this for a long time. And then I realized maybe that's not the best path for me. But yeah, that's the idea at that time, was just do economics to get a job that would earn me loads of money. Not really understanding exactly what that was. I didn't really care necessarily what that was. But then as time went on, so I ended up going to the Bank of England for a placement year. And that was obviously a good experience. But then straight after university, I actually struggled to get a job out of university. So I interviewed loads of different places and ended up going into tech consulting because I actually misunderstood, because the job title I thought was more business consulting.
Right.
So it's a complete fluke. And I think there's many different points from my life that are just complete flukes that make sense in hindsight and made it seem like I have some master plan when I really didn't.
So what was tech consulting like? Because it feels like a world away from what you're doing now.
So it's interesting because the tech consulting stuff does actually play into what I do now, because I can do all the website, I can do all of the, like I design the logo and things like that, right? Because I have that more technological background.
Nice logo.
Thank you. I was very proud. And initially it was a lot of like enterprise. So there's a reason why I kind of skim over this when I talk to people, because I always found it quite boring, but actually the skills it taught me were really useful. So if you think about what I was doing was very nerdy, like coding, database stuff, upgrades, infrastructure, especially in the earlier days, it was a lot around those areas. But because it was something I wasn't necessarily interested in, when I talked to other people within the companies and the business teams about it, I'd break it down quite well into something that was more understandable, because I didn't understand it myself in some ways. So because I didn't know I didn't have a computer science background like that, I had to use more terms I could understand, which enabled me to then work better with the business teams within those companies, because I just talked to them like people rather than coming from this more nerdy background. Not there's anything wrong with nerds, but that was why I was able to do it, because I wasn't such a technical driven person. It meant that I quite enjoyed being able to talk to people in the business about what I was doing. But then as I got further on, then I took more of a lead on the like design side. And that was a bit I think I enjoyed a lot more towards the end. So I was there for about 7 years, but towards the end, I was the main person on the design software. So I was teaching other people how to do that and was taking the lead on those different areas. And I designed projects like Vodafone, Heineken, Panasonic. And I was able to it was more creative, which I quite enjoyed on that design side. But I still had the technical knowledge and the problem solving bits there. But the main thing I learned from that is just being able to talk to people about things that are quite complicated in an easy to understand way. And that's essentially what writing is how do you take concepts which are quite confusing to different people, but make them easy to understand. So that was a core skill I think I got from consulting that filters into everything else I do.
And while you were there, you had your hand in different pies, different projects outside. Tell me about some of those.
So while I was there, so I always had stuff on the side as well. So I did karate until I was about 23, 24 before coming into work with black eye isn't necessarily the best thing for a client. And there was one time I got kicked in the jaw and I couldn't talk for about a week. So then I had to kind of be a bit more careful about, okay, I probably should pull back a bit more from that side of things. So it became, on that side, like karate was my really big passion when I was younger. but it just didn't really match up with the corporate world and what I was trying to do there. And there's always this idea that I want to go back into it in the future. But I've been saying that for a long time now, so I've got to be realistic about that could be something which I take on again later on in my life. And the projects at work, there's always something going on, but especially towards the beginning, I think a lot of people maybe don't understand this, but early career, nobody really says it. First couple of years, you're kind of useless. And I'm very much making loads of mistakes. And I was very lucky that the people senior to me were correcting my mistakes and helping me. And I think there's always this idea now, you go into a company and you've come straight out of university and you're going to hit the ground running, you're going to be amazing straight away. And the reality is, like, often you're not that good. And it's hard to know that until you get a bit senior. And often what happens is that it's what you don't know, right? If you don't know that this is how it should be done, you think you're amazing. And I think there's a lot of humble pie as I grew up through the ranks, like, oh yeah, I used to do things in that way. It really wasn't a very good idea. But at the time I thought I was so good. And the project's there, so I'm not sure what I'm allowed to talk about in terms of like the confidentiality stuff. It was these things of customer relationship management, right? Which is, it's CRM, so extremely boring. But it's the whole thing of how does the systems work so that when you, let's say for Vodafone, for example, you go into a shop and you want to buy something, how does it all work on the back end, right? So you have to put in your details. How does that get collected? How does that get shipped off? It was all of this logistics and stuff behind the scenes, which is then very useful for what I'm doing today, because the entire website for the Bay HQ, I built it, all this, like the content management system, all of those different things, because I actually know what I'm doing and how the relationships work between things. And rather than me hiring somebody, if someone was to build the website, it probably cost 50K, whereas I could just do it because I knew what I was doing. So that's where it really benefits on that side.
You're going to get people contacting you saying, hey, Amar, can you build my website for me?
Yeah. And the rate's like 3 times what I used to charge now. So it's the whole thing, I think, with those areas. Sometimes my challenge is that I'm lucky to have quite a breadth of skills. But by having a breadth of skills, it can lead you in too many different directions rather than really focusing on the thing that makes a difference. And that's what I've got to get better at, I think, myself, is that just because I can do something doesn't mean I should. It doesn't mean it's the best use of my time. And
you leave this, I mean, you learned a lot in the tech job, but were you fulfilled? Were you happy?
It really varied project by project. And I think so much is dependent on, one was a challenge, but it was also the people. If I like the people I was working with the client, then that makes such a huge difference. But it was that roller coaster of like, oh, I'm on this project and it's like, I'm going to be 6 months in it versus, okay, this one's quite interesting. But it just felt so out of my control. And I didn't really like that aspect of it, especially towards the end where once it gets to a level where I was pretty senior, a lot of the time it's just me leading a project, which can be quite lonely. Whereas earlier on, because you're working underneath somebody, you've got people above you to chat to. And especially as the way that the tech world and consulting world is adjusting, it's often it'll be me at the lead and then an offshore team. And you're just the conduit in between those two things where it's like, is this really where I want to head to? And I think for a long time before I actually quit and did what I was doing today or started that path, I knew I didn't want to do it long term, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So you're in this kind of inertia perspective of, okay, I could leave, but what am I going to do? So I might as well stay. And then you start getting good at stuff that you're not really interested in. I thought, well, what am I really doing here? And it was just, I was very lucky that things fell the way they did, because otherwise I'd been in this career. It's like, I don't really want to do this, but I don't know what else I'm going to do. And I think a lot of people at this point as well, where you don't want to start from scratch on something, but the world has changed. So before you'd start from scratch in a corporate world, you work your way up the ladder again. Whereas I started from scratch in something and then just taking it wherever I want to go now. And I didn't know that existed. Like the idea 5 years ago that I'd be running my own thing, it was just not even, it was never crossed my mind that I'll go and work for myself. I'll go and build my organization. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So literally 5 years ago, I'd never written anything. I'd never put my name out there. The idea of having a podcast, I never thought I'd have the guts to do that. So in this last 5 years, I've completely changed. And you wouldn't know that unless you knew me from before.
So let's take a step back. What made you take the leap of faith and quit the day job?
So I was very fortunate in some ways because I was able to earn so much money on the side before I quit. So the initial spark was New Year's resolution, January 2020, I'll start writing online, new year, new me, that kind of crap. And you all do it. And you know, like, oh, I'm going to go to the gym every day. I don't go to the gym every day, but well, I did it for a little bit. But you know how you think, okay, I'm going to do this new thing. And the idea behind that was just I was reading a lot and I was getting into like reading, blogging. So I was like, okay, I think I can do this. But it was more of an intellectual stimulation challenge kind of idea, more than I'm going to earn loads of money. Because I knew the stats, right? The stats are realistically nobody earns any money from content creation. Most people are broke. if you can earn $100 a month, you're doing like top percentile. You can't live on $100 a month. But I got very lucky that the first article I ever wrote earned me, I think, $3K. So when I had that initial introduction, then the pandemic hit a couple months later. I suddenly have loads of free time on my hands where I can't go out, I can't do anything else. You can do Zoom and the games, but it's not very fun, is it? So, and then I had this thing that I was suddenly good at that people were praising me for and people were encouraging me on. So by the time we came to June 2021 and I left my job, I'd already been earning quite a significant amount on the side and validated it. But at the same time, I don't think I would have quit if my dad hadn't like encouraged me to do so. So I'd where anybody's had a corporate job, right? You kind of like whine and rant a lot about like, oh, this boss and like, oh, I can't do this and I can't do that. And oh, I'm going to quit. But you know, you're not actually going to do it in many ways. Like people just have this venting aspect. And I think I've been doing that for quite some time of like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this. But I didn't think I was actually going to do it myself. You're just venting. But then my dad was like, just go and do it. And I was like, but what do you mean? And then I was like, what about pensions? What about, like, I had no idea any of that stuff worked. I was like, okay, if I quit, but then what about, like, how's it going to look at my CV? It's like, I haven't updated my CV for about 5 years. It's totally irrelevant to me now. But when you're in that kind of position, you don't think, it was all these things that scare you. And the fact that my dad was like, you'll be fine, we'll work out, quit, just do it. It just took me by surprise. And I remember I took a week off in February 2021 where I made a presentation, I made my business plan, my business model, and I then presented it to my family in the living room. And then I was like, that was cool, but I was like, I was already telling you to quit, so you don't need to convince me. And it was almost this whole exercise I went through to try and convince myself. And by the time I left, then I think there was just so much. I remember just being so anxious at the time about what am I an idiot here, right? You know, I think that was the thing I was so worried about. I was like, what everyone's going to judge me? I'm the person who's gone from good grades to good university to a city corporate job. And then, oh, now you're a writer. Oh, cool. Like, do you know what I mean? It was that real identity shift of having to break down what I thought was success or prestige or status.
So who is Amar, the person?
I knew that was coming. I just set myself up for that one.
You set yourself up.
So what's really interesting is before my dad passed away obviously a couple of years ago, right? Before that time, so much of my writing and so much of my creativity was all around self-awareness, right? It was me understanding myself and the different elements of why I do what I do. Even, for example, me being able to tell you that a big reason why I was worried about my job is that insecurity around how people perceive me. I'm quite understanding, right? I know myself quite well in terms of my flaws, and I might still do things that I know are dumb, but at least I know it's dumb. Even when I was younger, I used to go on holidays a lot. I've been to about 50 countries. Well, I've been to 50 countries. I enjoy travel, yes, but also I can say I've been to 50 countries because then people think, oh, wow, it's so cool, right? And I knew that about myself. I'm doing this out of insecurity too. And now the interesting challenge is it's trying to rediscover what is the point of any of this, right? Because I've got many of the status symbols, right? Now I've been on a billboard, that stuff, right? None of that really matters to me, right? And it's quite difficult for people to understand that we haven't had that. But for me, it's this idea of, I'm really driven by the challenge of the BHQ, right? The strategy side of things, like, oh, this is actually fun. But then it's also just the dumb jokes and stuff, right? That I don't get to do enough anymore. And that side of me of just being able to like be a bit silly and like do stupid things, I miss that side. And it's things like playing football every week with my mates and things like that. Like dancing, like obviously I love Bhangra, I love like those things too. Spending time with family. And it's really trying to get that separation in place more and more. Where it's, okay, the Bay HQ, this is me business, but there's that stuff outside of things with my other interests, with the dance, with the Bhangra, with the football, all these kind of things too, that I want to also nurture, and spending time with family and friends too, that aren't necessarily just friends with me because I'm potentially useful to them.
And where does that work ethic that you've got come from? Because often we trace it back to our parents or the people around us. Where does yours come from?
The earliest example I can think of this is when I was at year 7, year 8. For some reason I was a massive goody two-shoes, and I don't quite know why I was such a suck-up, but I was. So there was like a year 7 award for commitment, and I won that. Then the next year I won it for attainment. And it was the top person in the class, right? And I don't know why, like, for some reason I just really cared about this stuff. And it probably does initially come from insecurity. Okay, it comes from insecurity. I know why this is, right? So it's me trying to prove myself, me being, okay, I'm useful, I'm important, whatever. And then later on, I think it comes down to, it's being in the environment I was in, right? So one, I'm Punjabi. So it's all about strength, all about puffing your chest out and all those kind of things. Went to an all-boys school in Ilford. So obviously in that very like toxic, well, say toxic masculine, but there was like whatever, right? Where you're constantly surrounded by other people. You need to show you're tough, there's like that alpha kind of game, right? In some ways. And I definitely was an alpha, but you need to show that you weren't weak more than anything else. And I think that need to show that I wasn't weak really carried over into many different things. And obviously I did karate, but I had quite significant injuries like early on. And being able to, I just trained through like stupid injuries that people shouldn't train through because I needed to prove strength and show that strength. And there was some element of, okay, yeah, there's fights and stuff that go on in Ilford, whatever. But there was some element of just fear within me of why it wasn't as bad as I think I had it in my head. But for some reason, I was more scared about the environment, about like the knife crime and stuff like that, where I was scared of that stuff. So I had to go out of my way to show strength. And I think that carried on for a lot of my early like adult life, especially until I was about 25, 26. And then I think what started to flip for me there is, especially growing up in that kind of environment, mental health wasn't a thing, right? There was, you're a weirdo or you're crazy. That was it. But what I started seeing is that some of my most successful friends on paper, or I say on paper on Instagram, right? Where the people who, they're very popular, they're very cool, or whatever like that. I started realizing that quite a few of them had quite traumatic things that happened to them. And it broke my mentality of what status is in some ways. I realized that so many of these people who are high status, they're doing that because they're trying to cover up something which had happened to them beforehand, or they maybe had depression, or they had some kind of anxiety. And that really flipped the way I thought about the world, because so much of my world had been then like, you need to show you're strong. You need to show you're strong because that's how you survive. That's how you get ahead. Whereas then like actually some of the people I consider really close friends had actually had this stuff that had been quite serious happen to them. And some people I knew had been through like really severe bouts of mental illness. I was like, well, if they've done that and I look up to them, then maybe I don't, like maybe this isn't a weakness thing. Maybe I don't need to think about things in that way. And again, I think that's what triggered in that initial bout of me reading a lot more. So I started reading a lot more books. I started getting into the blogging. And that's what led me down that path to starting to write. And I think the turning point was about, I want to say about 25, 26, where the whole idea I had about the world started to shift a bit of actually, this is more normal. Because you read about it in the news, right? Oh, this happens and that happens and mental health and stuff. But when you've grown up in an environment where you can't show that, you don't really take it seriously. But I think that was the thing that shifted for me over time, is that, oh, okay, people I know have got mental health issues. People I know are on antidepressants. So actually, there isn't this need to show strength. You can talk about your emotions and show vulnerability. And that led to writing, which then triggered down everything else. We hope you're enjoying the episode so far. We just want to give a quick shout out to our headline partners, HSBC Innovation Banking. One of the biggest challenges for so many startups is finding the right bank to support them. Because you might start off and try to use a traditional bank, but they don't understand what you're doing. You're just talking to an AI assistant, or you're talking to somebody who doesn't really understand what it is you've been trying to do. HSBC have got the team that are built out over years to make sure they understand what you're doing. They've got the deep sector expertise, and they can help connect you with the right people to make your dreams come true. So if you want to learn more, check out hsbcinnovationbanking.com.
You mentioned kind of showing your vulnerabilities in your writing, stuff you'll post on socials, for example. You will talk about your trauma and your grief, specifically around your father's passing. How does that help you?
In some ways, it's a weird thing of it's a responsibility. It's a duty, I see it in some ways, and it's quite frustrating, because I think what I did before my dad passed, I made a very big point around being self-aware and making sure that you don't lie about how you feel. And that got very much stress tested, and all of a sudden I had to deal with something quite serious. So it's easy to say that kind of stuff when you're dealing with the normal everyday stresses of life. But when you're dealing with it in that extreme moment, and it's a whole annoying thing about being self-aware, and having written and got millions of views about writing about self-awareness, that I knew what was going on. And it's like, I wish I didn't say all that stuff now, because now I don't want to be a hypocrite in some ways. And I realize I have a platform, and it's also my background now, right? So you've got black belt in karate, national squad, done obstacle courses around the world. there's so many different proof points I have that gives me that general world idea of masculinity and strength. So I see it as I've got some level of duty that if I can show that even though I've got all this stuff, even though I can put myself through extreme pain and I've done all these different things, that grief is still something which I deal with and I struggle with, then I have the responsibility in some ways to do that. And it's a weird thing of, I don't know if it really helps me. It does. I think it helps me in terms of clear writing is clear thinking. So if I've got a jumbled up brain, but I can write something down and I have to edit it and try to make it intelligible to other people, that helps me to process my thinking too. And people say, for example, journaling. And what they don't realize, when I was a professional writer, journaling is not an escape because writing is associated with work to me now. Writing isn't a fun thing for me now. Writing is my livelihood, right? And when I'm publishing it publicly, then I'm crafting it. I'm thinking about, okay, how do I make this as the point as clear as possible? And in the process of doing that, I'm also clearing up my own thinking. And I think that's what I'd advise anybody who wants to get into writing. The likelihood you're going to go viral is basically zero. Don't get into it because you think you're going to be rich, because you're not. And like most people fail. And I was a massive anomaly in terms of me being able to quit my job for the writing income I was making. But the amount I learned about myself and being able to get clearer about my own thoughts, that's the real value. And if you can do that, and whether it's grief, whatever you're dealing with, that's a huge thing that people underplay the importance of.
And obviously we've been talking about your writing and you talking about your father's passing. How was your father's death a turning point in your career?
So it's interesting that the idea for the Bay HQ was actually while he's in hospital. So the background to the story is, so I was in New York for a holiday or business trip, whatever it is, so meeting people I'd interacted with in the writing world. And while I was out there, he then went into hospital for COVID. So I had to fly back, and until the day actually passed, I think that's the most traumatic day, because in midair, I didn't know when I landed whether or not I'd be alive or not. So trying to explain that to the airport and not being able to get my words out, and just, that was very just, it's hard to even explain now, right, of how that feeling is, right, of just trying to tell them I need to get on the next plane because of this. And I'm saying this now, but I was I just couldn't function. And he was in ICU for a couple of weeks, and he was meant to come out a couple of weeks later. And they'd given us a date. Then it got pushed back a little bit because, okay, he needs to stay a few more days. So during that period, there was no thought in my head that he wouldn't make it out. And this is where the idea for the BHQ came about with my co-founder, and I had this idea. And the idea was my dad was going to get involved in it. So he would be one of the first podcast guests. And I'd done podcasts before, like 100 other places, but he'd never really been involved in that stuff. But with my dad at the point, so he just sold his business and things like that. It was, he wants to be in that situation where he can contribute and give back. Obviously, things didn't work out like that. And I think once he passed, you're floundering around basically, right, of what's the point of any of this crap, right? Like, oh, I've interviewed the founders of Netflix and Twitter, so what? Like, it sounds good and it opens up doors for me, but does that make a difference to my life? Have I changed anybody's life because of those interviews? Maybe they have, I don't know, but I can't live off that forever, right? It's got to be, what actual difference am I making? And so much of my life at that point was very virtual. So it's a lot of things with people in America. And the reason why I never moved to America, despite the audience stuff I had there, is because I knew about my dad not being particularly well. So I didn't want to move across the world. And then I went to New York for 2 weeks and that happened, right? So it's kind of, it had that stress on me, right? But once he passed, and we had a lot of letters from his clients. So he was an accountant. He worked his way up from nothing through an old school law firm, got right to the top. And then by the time he passed, he was right at the top of the organization for like 10 years. So we got loads of letters from his clients being like, oh, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, your dad's the reason why I had a roof over my head. He's the reason why I could feed my kids, because he put in the extra work when he didn't have to. So some of my dad's clients were huge and they were very famous and household names. But he also had a lot of the smaller clients that were people from where he grew up in Forest Gate, or his family friends, people like that. A lot of smaller clients that, in terms of the overall picture of money, he shouldn't have even bothered taking them on. But he had all these people that came from the same background he did that he helped lift up. And when those people, you're seeing them at the funeral, and so many people, even recently, it was somebody who you met who I never knew, But they said that my dad was their accountant and family friend. And he was talking about how my dad had helped them so much in their career and like give them introductions and got them into different roles and things like that. And I think it was such a huge role my dad played for so many people that obviously I know about some of it, but you didn't talk about it because why would you talk about it, right? So there's always things that were unsaid because it was a surprise. It's an annoying thing because he was in hospital, yes, but we didn't think he'd actually pass. And he never acted in that way ever, right? He was always invincible in his eyes. And I think it's common, like old Indian person thing to do, right? Indian dad things like, yeah, he's going to live forever in terms of his own head. But then seeing all of that, it's like, okay, now I have this platform, which is very American heavy. So a lot of people think I came out of nowhere. And well, actually, no, I had millions of views. I had tens of thousands of followers. I had all this thing, but just a Silicon Valley based audience. So when I started at BHQ, I already had this massive experience. But what shifted for me there is, okay, now this is the main thing. And I cut a lot of my clients. I had a lot of the clients I was writing for. And obviously, with the reach I had, I could charge quite a lot for these clients. So I cut all of these people I could essentially print money in some ways through them. I didn't pay myself for a year and a half after that. And there's a lot of pain that went through that. But that was the thing of it's just trying to find something to cling on to. And the idea I can have in my head is because of what my dad did, then that's the only reason I am my time today. If my dad didn't encourage me to quit my job, I probably wouldn't have quit. And we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't have had any of the conversations I've had. And there's so many people who don't have that in their families, who don't have that in their friendship groups. So if the Bay HQ is that thing, that is that support system for the people who don't have the support I had, then I'm paying forward that belief my dad had in me.
Sounds like your dad was a huge inspiration for you.
Absolutely. And I say, well, I've interviewed 320 something people, but it's like I never got to interview my dad. And that would be the one that would obviously be very telling. And I think one of the things I think my dad did extremely well, and I don't know many of the entrepreneurs I've interviewed who've done that, is he had this amazing separation between work and personal life. And something which I wish I could learn from him because I'm not very good at it, where he was obviously very highly strung at work. He had all these employees and things like that. He had so much to do. But when he was at home, we just didn't know about any of it. He just had that amazing separation. When it's home and he's present. When it's at work, is at work. And I don't know how he did it. I don't understand. And it's that gap of I wish I could learn it from him, of how he was able to be such a good family person, but also clearly be very good at his job as well.
Is that the one question you'd like to ask him if you could have had him on the podcast?
I think I never understood how selfless he was and how he could be so selfless, where there was a time he was in hospital and he was not looking very good. And then the first thing he could say once he hadn't been able to talk for a couple of days is, oh, how's mum doing? I was like, you're in hospital. Like, it's just, he just always had thinking about other people. And I don't get how he was able to be so selfless and to always think about other people. And I think that's a thing that I just don't understand. Because I think so many of our role models today are very much about themselves. And they might in the media or in public talk about what impact they're making, things like that. My dad did so many things for so many different organizations that aren't in the papers that people never knew about because he didn't advertise it. But he'd just give the money behind the scenes, or he'd help people out without needing the credit. I think sometimes now people want to do good things, but they want the credit for it. And it's even with the Bay HQ, my philosophy for this is that in 5 years' time, I hope nobody even remembers that I built it, because I built an organization which stands on its own 2 feet and people trust it. And if I'm still involved as a chairman or whatever like that, it's not I'm the guy, it's just I'm one of the people in there. But it's the organization that's trusted, that people believe in. And in 30 years' time, yeah, it's cool that I made it, but actually people aren't coming there for me or for my person or my personality, because we've been able to attract a tribe of people who are continuing on that good work. And that's the thing that I see it as, it's not about me. It's weird because it's about me to start off with to get it off the ground. But if I don't let go of that, then it becomes a cult, not a community. And it's a very clear thing I have in my head. It's like, I'm building a community, not a cult.
Why do you think that's important, like the work that you're doing here at Bay HQ?
I think it comes down to there's so many people who've been to our events and said about how lonely they are and how much they've struggled. They're trying to do something and nobody believes in them. And I was just very fortunate, and I just see it as that idea of paying it forwards. And if you look at the macro level as well, where there's a lot of Asians who created small businesses, and it's very popular in the 70s and 80s, corner shops, petrol stations, but there's a lot fewer being able to build out those larger businesses. And especially look at the big problems of today's world, like the health sector, the climate sector. If we don't have the voices from people like us in there, then the solutions aren't going to match that too, right? And there's so many innovative ideas. There's people who right now are listening who maybe have an idea, or if they work for something they truly believed in, can make such a huge difference to people's lives, but they won't start it because they haven't been conditioned in that way, because people in their family wouldn't believe in them, or people in their community would judge them. That's the thing I think about success of this whole thing. In 30 years' time, are the people who've built organizations which have completely changed the world, who wouldn't have done it if we didn't exist. And we'll never be able to measure that properly, right? We won't know. People won't go on a podcast in 20 years' time and say, oh, I started because I listened to this one episode of the BHQ. But that's the idea, right? Can they get an internship through us when they're at school? Can they then get mentorship from us? Can they listen to the podcast and learn? Can they come to our events? And it's that whole idea of that perfect person or the perfect age now, where they can come through the entire system with us. And what impact and what difference can they make that I don't even know about? I have no idea what their ideas are, but they can change the world, and they wouldn't do it otherwise.
Have you had a moment already where someone has said, look, it's made an impact?
There's one of the interesting things is, I'm trying to anonymize this. There's somebody who said that when they came across us, then they were in a very low point in their life and they didn't know if they were going to continue. And because of why we included them, and I didn't notice at the time, but we got them involved in some things and we helped them out, then they met new friends, they got new involved, they got a community, and it gave them the push to carry on, where they were very much considering like more like, do they end their life essentially, right? And when somebody says something like that to me, that makes a way bigger difference. Like, oh, I got 10 more followers because of you. I didn't give a crap about that, right? But when there's people out there who are really struggling, who've been able to do that, and the thing is, we're not a mental health charity, right? We're not any of that stuff, but that's the element of what the community can do. And it's more soft. It's not going for the jugular, but I think we can often underestimate how much feeling like somebody belongs really matters to people. And there's other elements too, again, where people have listened to episodes and they said that, again, it's encouraged them to go and build what they wanted to build. And there's people who came to our events and then quit their jobs soon afterwards. And we've done it before at other companies where people have said, like, I've had this idea for years, but I never thought I could do it. But then now I've made a bunch of friends and I think maybe I can. So that it's a binary switch, right? There's so many people who are going to have in 20 years' time that regret of never starting something and never knowing whether or not it could be what their life's work would have been. And there's other people who maybe don't have their regret or aren't going to have their regret in 20 years' time because of what we've done.
What's it like hearing people say, this has made an impact in my life?
It's weird. It's very surreal. And in some ways, I still see this as the baby days. I see this as we've barely done anything so far. So sometimes when I get a lot of praise and people tell me a very common thing, people are like, oh, your dad would be so proud of you. And for me, it's just, I understand their intentions, but it doesn't necessarily help me because it just highlights the absence. But it's also, I just see this as we've barely even begun. There's so much more work we can do and we should do. And I don't want to get complacent. And I think it's so easy to get complacent from praise. And, like even say awards and things like that. We haven't nominated ourselves for any awards because I want to win an award. Or if we win an award, I want to be because it's deserved and because people believe we should have it, rather than we've just entered ourselves in every possible award we can get, which is what a lot of people do. And I see it as we're barely even begun. There's so much more work to do. So it's lovely to get the praise now, but I don't let it get to my head because even say for the billboard, for example, right? So what I'm on a billboard, right? Is can I get 50 people from our community on a billboard? Can over the next 10 years, can there be so many people who've had their names heard and are role models for young people because of what I've done? That's way more important to me than me on a billboard.
I'm sure you took a selfie with you in that billboard, right?
We had a photo shoot, but even with that, it was interesting that I think there is some level of numbness that comes with the whole grief side of things too, right? It's that none of the wins feel massively high to me. It's, okay, that was cool, next thing. And I don't know if I was like that before, if it's a post-grief thing or not. But I definitely think that's an element, but it's also an element which keeps me from getting too complacent, getting too big-headed, because I just see it as this. As also, I'm very lucky. I'm speaking to people like you and speaking to so many people who've done incredible things that it's very difficult for me to like, oh, I'm everything, I'm the dog shit, right? Because actually I'm constantly talking to people who've done amazing things. So for me, that's normalized, right? For me, it's very normal for people to do incredible things. So I'm constantly inspired by the people that get talked to every week.
How are you dealing with grief? Because I imagine it's still very much at the forefront.
So at the time of recording this, it's just after Father's Day and my dad's birthday.
Like a few days ago.
Yeah. So right now, it's also the element of because people think about authenticity, right? And authenticity, there's a difference between how I am when the cameras are off and things like that versus like, there's no point in me doing this interview if it's just a ball on the floor, right? That would be authentic, but it would be pretty useless. And that's the things that I think sometimes people struggle with is that everything I say today is true, but would I also be completely, like a few days ago, I'd be in bed trying to nap my way through the day to get through Father's Day just to get it over and done with. And that's what I was doing. I was trying to sleep my way through the day, I was spending time with family, watching TV, trying to just work out how do I get through this day so I can, okay, now it's the next day. And there is that dissonance, which is quite difficult to deal with, I think, of me being on stage, me being on camera with what's going on behind the scenes. And I'm very open about what's going on behind the scenes. And that's where I try to make sure that I'm not being fake in any way. But there is still that weird element of me performance versus me relaxed and chilled and with family. And that's quite hard to marry up of how do I, and something I'm learning right at the moment is how do I connect those two things? And one thing I'm doing intentionally is that during the summer period, I'm very much slowing down in terms of the work stuff and meeting up with people and things like that, because I know this is a tough period for me because it starts to get into the death anniversary time and it's the milestones just bring things into light again. So you can distract yourself, but when it's the milestones, it's hard to distract yourself. And I'd say I'm way better today than I was this time last year, but am I good is quite debatable. And it's also, if I was like amazingly happy and so I think that would be a weird reaction to, like, it's not a human reaction, right? Like, this is totally normal for me to be acting the way I am. And that's what I try and tell people as well, is that me trying to spin this into, oh, I'm so happy and like it's like 2 years since my dad died. Of course I'm not bloody happy, right? But it's being able to accept, okay, this is a sad moment, but that doesn't mean I can't also do things that make me happy. And it's trying to find that right balance. There'll be more good days than bad days. And I think especially I would say March to about May this year was probably the happiest I've been in quite a long time. And then now we're getting into the grief cycle again of the milestones. But then I know that I had that period, which was really good. So I know myself, I can be like that again. And it's that whole challenge I have between performing me versus actual me. And I want to have that separation a bit stronger as well of who's actually my friend from this world versus who's in the business sense, and trying to gauge that. And it's a very complicated thing to work through. And I'm still trying to work out who to trust and who not to trust in some ways as well with that more deeper stuff.
And you say it's not helpful when people say, look, your dad would have been really proud of you. But have you ever stopped to think what he would have thought about what you've built so far?
So it comes back to even what I said when I was at school, right? It's my dad being like, you're working too hard, take more breaks. That's what he would be saying. And he'd even say that just before we passed and what I was doing with the writing side. My dad was always that person who was more about, are you okay? As opposed to, I'm so proud of how well your business is doing. And it's not that he would be happy about the billboard, be happy at these different things, and he'd be proud of that. But at the same time, that wasn't what made him happy. He'd be more happy if I was happy, or if I was doing things where he's like, oh, okay, like, yeah, and that's what I'm very fortunate about, right? Because most people don't have that. It's unconditional. It's not based on my success of whether or not he was proud of me. He was proud of me regardless. And that's a challenge of when I'm explaining that to people, because he wouldn't really care about this stuff I'm doing in some ways, right? Well, he would obviously care, but it wouldn't be, if I wasn't doing this, if I was still doing my day job, he'd be just as proud of me. And that's something which, like I said, a lot of it is driven by my own weird masochist sense of trying to help people or trying to do something bigger and better. And it's not driven by, I need to prove to my dad that I can do something. And I know that's different for a lot of people. A lot of people are driven by, they need to prove to their parents they're successful. Whereas like my mum was like, she knows what we do. She's been to a couple of events and she's proud of me, whatever. But that's not the most important thing to her. She's more concerned about, am I happy? What am I doing? Am I eating right? Those kind of things. And it's very important to have that separation, I think, where, especially with people very close to you, say whether it's family, whether it's your best friends, if they're only happy for you when you're doing well professionally, then that's not really, and that's one of the big things I've learned from them, right? So whenever I treat people in that way, the people closest to me, I don't really care what they're doing professionally. I don't care about I care about the promotions if it makes them happy, but I'm not like, yes, my best friend got promotion, so I've got more successful friends. That's just not the way I think.
So what is next for you then?
So the big thing, like I said, is the next 5 years is how do I transition the Bay HQ from being dependent on me to making its organisation stand on its own 2 feet? And it sounds weird that I was trying to remove myself from it, but I'd see that as massive success if I can build something which can stand on its own 2 feet. If and like a baby, right? If I need to still be in charge in 30 years' time, I failed as a parent of this company. And if I can grow it so it's standing on its own 2 feet and it can look after itself, then I've been successful in terms of my leadership. And the example I always use is Alex Ferguson at Man United. So don't know how much you care about football and don't much the audience cares, but it's Alex Ferguson, most successful manager ever in Britain, right? And the thing is, as soon as he left, then the club hasn't won anything major since then. It's had all these different problems. And obviously, he's like, I'm not going to try and be better than him, but I think there's a mistake he made there of like that transition phase. And I think so many businesses make that failure of that transition. And that's one of the things I'm very focused on. If I want this to last for generations, I've got to be able to make a transition successfully. And it's always thinking about that in advance. Me and Gerber started this, but it can't be dependent on us, because then what about if I get hit by a bus tomorrow? This is done. And that's the key thing I'm thinking about, is how do we make it in that light? And once we've got to that position, I can just do whatever I want for fun, right? And that's the position where we get into in the future, where I can start getting back into my karate. I can start doing these different things where I have this level of freedom. And again, I'm very lucky in terms of what we can do through this, which should give me financial independence and things like that, where I'm not bothered about how much money we're making and things like that. It's more about, what do I actually enjoy? And that's going to change. What I say today I enjoy is probably completely different by the time I get there, but that's part of the excitement, right? I can experiment again, I can try out different things. Whereas at the moment, there's a level of duty and responsibility, which can be quite a heavy burden sometimes, right? Of I need to make sure that I'm representing a huge number of amazing people. And there's a burden that comes with that, and responsibility that comes with that too.
Amar, thank you for this conversation and for trusting me to do your job for the day. In keeping with tradition, quick rapid fire questions. Who would be your dream podcast guest?
So if we're not talking British Asian, so the stat I always bring out is that I was second fastest person on Medium after Barack Obama. So I think it's got to be Obama. That would be pretty cool.
That's cheating a bit, but I'll take it. How can people help you right now? What is it that you need?
The biggest thing is just what you say about us when we're not in the room. So if you can tell your friends about us, if you can tell your WhatsApp groups about us, if you can tell your friends to come to our events, and that's one of the really heartwarming things we've had, is how many people come to an event and ask them, like, how did you find out about us? And I said, oh, my friend went to your last event and they told me to come to this one. And they said, you've got to come. And I think that's the best thing anybody can do is listening, is that if you enjoyed this, if you enjoy what you're about, tell a couple of friends about us. If you tell 2 friends and they tell 2 friends, that exponentially grows very quickly.
Thank you. Thanks, Amar.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.